What is up, guys? Welcome back to OverTakes. This is Misfit. On today's episode, we are going to rounds 2 and 3 of the Overwatch League playoffs. We're going to talk about the Asia bracket and the North America bracket and some of the other overall feel of the tournament so far. We'll get into that first before we dive into the matches and what happened and all that kind of stuff. Some of it's going to play together, but we're going to talk about a little bit about meta, more about the macro of what's going on with this tournament and my feelings on it and that kind of thing. I have a lot to say about, what's going on with it, meta shifts and all of that stuff included in there. Forced meta shifts, if you will. So before I get into that, I'd like to thank everybody out there on YouTube who've been supporting me. Thank you very much. It's greatly appreciated. Everybody out there that's new, thank you very much for tuning in. I do Overwatch League content anywhere from 3 to 5 times a week, depending on what's going on. Obviously, we're in the middle of the playoffs, so you're going to be seeing a lot of stuff from me. And then in the in-between, between the playoffs and the grand finals, I am going to be doing some stuff. We're going to recap some teams' years that haven't made it. We're going to start that early and talk about teams that are out when the time comes leading up to it. We're going to talk about all-star games and all the stuff that they have planned on the in-between. And of course, get to the grand finals. I do appreciate all of your support that's been going on. It means a lot to me. Let's just say that. Let's start talking about the playoffs in general. We had a recap of the play-ins and the knockout rounds. We didn't get to the Asia first round knockouts. We'll get to that when we start talking the Asia bracket. It is a lot smaller, a lot less to talk about as far as matches go and whatnot. My bracket's been destroyed like everybody else's, so, here we are. And we'll dive into that in a minute, but I want to talk about the macro of the playoffs first. There are a lot of things that are going on here. Aside from the normal playoff stuff, the tension and all that, with the good stuff, there's some side things that are making this playoff seem kind of artificial in a way for me. We're going to get to the justice in a minute. And this is not going to be a 5-minute bash on the justice and all that kind of stuff before we even get there. Most of it, for me, lies in the meta. Now, going into this, we had a lot of teams performing really well on a variety of stuff. A lot of double shield, a lot of different things that have progressed through the season. With hero pools and that, we kind of have a stabilized meta, minus, you take out a character, you put in a character, minus some of those weeks where everybody got banned and it was just a free-for-all shit show. Like the last 2 weeks, which didn't matter anyway in the grand scheme because everybody knew they were going to be on a different patch. This is where I have some of the problem with the playoffs. We have taken from February until the end of August, running on various patches with minor adjustments. Yes, COVID had a lot to do with some of the stuff that was going on, but we knew what was going to happen with certain things. Yes, shields needed to be nerfed. It was kind of boring. They worked on that. They gave us hero pools, which worked to an extent, but not really as much as we wanted it to. It created a lot of chaos and a lot of undue stress for the players. But this patch, dropping this patch and putting it in before the most crucial time of your season, not only viewership-wise, but play-wise, was probably not the best thing, especially this patch. This was not a minor patch where you had, an adjustment to Sombra and another rework of Torbjorn or something like that. This is obliterated shields. We enabled Roadhog to no end. We just changed the game going into this. A lot of the play this weekend was kind of sloppy and just all over the place. People trying to figure out a meta in the first week of the playoffs and trying to play for their lives. Yes, some of those teams shouldn't even have been in there in the first place, which I get why they did everybody ggets to play. I'm not that guy that buys into it 100%. Does it make it a little fun? Sure. It's a little bit of fun. You get to see teams like Boston upset Houston, but in the grand scheme of things, they wouldn't even have been there. Both of those teams. And then you have, which we're going to talk about in a second, then you have, Washington going on a run because they were enabled by a meta shift at the playoffs. Perfect timing for them. They were also enabled by circumventing rules on contracts and players to pick up players that didn't necessarily fit into the grand scheme of their team for 99% of the season. But through a loophole, they got to put Decay on their team, which is obviously paying dividends. And also the fact that Decay, and I believe some of this stuff, and you guys can hate me, whatever. A little bit of defense for Dallas here. I'm not a fan of the contract structure in the Overwatch League. Now, what this is doing, the players are way too enabled. I want the players to be enabled to a certain extent. I do feel like they need a players association, some kind of thing for some of the stuff that gets exploited. But one of the things that they have in their favor is they can hold teams hostage, much like Decay did. Crimzo even said it. You can misinterpret it, interpret it however you want. He's not wrong. And if you look at Dallas on the whole, they are literally paying 2 guys to play Valorant right now because of contract structuring and the way they're structured. Yeah, you sign these contracts, sure. You're going through the league bylaws on how they're structured. So they are kind of in the player's favor to an extent. So Dallas loses a player, the meta shifts, and we have Washington now taking matches away from teams, even though they shouldn't even be in the playoffs in the grand scheme of competitive anything. A team with that level, and that goes for the Bostons and the Houstons as well, and some of the other teams that are on the fence in that. Teams like Chengdu and London, they wouldn't have been in. Those teams would have been, fighting in playoff knockout things, or to get into the play-in tournament, or however it was structured at the beginning of the season. These teams would not have been there if we had rolled out that format. But, in competitive fairness with teams, I understand with COVID and all that, why they did that. But to the Decay thing, I don't like the way the league structured the rules for contracts enabled Washington to go the gray route and do the thing with Elevote and all that and make them better. And then you take a meta shift where you take a guy who was exceptional on Zarya and a guy that was really good on Roadhog and just run that and run through people. All right, running through Vancouver, not a feat. I'll give them that. I think in a regular meta situation, Dallas and them would have been close. Now, this is not necessarily saying Dallas would have never played them, first of all, going by start of the league, unless it was in the play-in tournament. But say they did. I think Dallas was a tick better. This is just the way it is. I mean, Washington takes advantage of stuff. They have guys out there looking. If you think about mid-season, when Corey and Stratus left, they picked up Janu and Stitch. Yeah, they didn't work out fantastically, but they're looking at rosters, looking at people who are getting dropped, and they're high-level players, and eventually they come around. And guys, this is in no way disparaging Decay as a player. He's playing at a top level, but also the rest of the Justice are. He's playing for the Justice right now, and very well shouldn't be there. Let's be brutally honest. 3 days before this whole thing started, with the way they set up the rosters, he would have never been on there. So, yeah, it's a lot of conjecture and opinions and things like that. I'm not going to take away from Washington what they did, because not only did he perform, Decay, Janu and Stitch performed really well. AimGod and Arc played really well. The whole team has been playing out of their minds. But I just feel like it would have been different. And mostly, other than the signings with Washington, it also is, and a couple other teams, it is the meta. This dropping the patch in the middle, or at the end of the regular season to go into the playoffs, much like they've done in the last 2 years, where they released a hero last year in Sigma, and then the year before we had that double sniper meta in season 1 that enabled London. It's enabling teams that had less of a chance, if not a chance, to do anything, to do something like Washington. Even Boston beating Houston. You can throw that in there. Those are the 2 big upsets. And it also did something which took a team that was in the top 4 in Paris and knocked them out nearly immediately. Washington came in, destroyed them, and then they went down into the lower bracket and lost as well. I don't like how that metric works. Paris was really good all year long, and they got screwed by a meta that they weren't necessarily great in. That stuff bothers me. It just doesn't give the way the meta is working out and the way these teams are going up and down, trying to figure it out. It's giving excuses for losses, which are valid to an extent, and giving pats on the back to teams for wins that also aren't necessarily deserved. Yes, you have to adapt in this game. You have to play at your top level, no matter what. That I understand that. But there's some teams that are benefiting, some teams are losing. Like in all other sports, when things go and change, the cream does rise to the top. And if you look at both brackets, you still have Shock, Fusion at the top, and then you have Shanghai at the top still in the Asia bracket. Seoul's an outlier. They obviously had high expectations at the beginning of the year, just haven't performed all year until recently again. This is the second time they've done that this year. But, Guangzhou's still in the mix. So, New York Excelsior still in the mix. Do you expect them to be in the losers bracket? Probably not. One of them was going to be anyway the way it's working out. But the cream does rise to the top. The best teams that are left, and if you look in the losers bracket right now, you have the teams that were fighting it out in the middle all year long are down there. For the most part, minus Washington. A lot of the arguments that I'm even making right now, yeah, it's discussion topics. It discusses some people. It turns them off to the game. But in the grand scheme, the cream rises to the top. Yeah, San Francisco doesn't look as great as they did a month, 2 months ago. Philadelphia does. Shanghai does. And the other teams look good. And the teams in NA that we're having this grand discussion about, and I'm literally tearing my own arguments apart, they weren't going to necessarily do anything anyway. The upsets, there was two. I believe Atlanta beating Paris, which had nothing to do with Washington. Outlaws losing to Boston. Those are the two, to me, that were the big ones. Sure, you can make arguments for other stuff, but look, the Valiant have beaten the Mayhem every time this year. The Mayhem have beaten the Gladiators every time this year. San Francisco beat Washington. Philadelphia disposed of the Gladiators. They've beaten them. They've had a couple of close matches. There's nothing in my mind that says that those teams that were in the middle are in the same position that they would have been in a regular playoff format that we would have had at the beginning of the year. The cream is rising to the top. Yeah, sure. I root for the Mayhem. It would be great to see them, they beat the Valiant. I would have loved that. I'm more and more not liking the Valiant because they're beating my team. We can argue about these points about how good the Reign RV, the Mayhem, the Valiant, the Justice, the Eternal, the Gladiators. That team from 3 to 6 is right where I thought they would be, minus maybe Paris. They did not show up against the Atlanta Reign. And that loss, I wouldn't call it directly. That had something to do with the meta. But, it is what it is. But the Justice is the egregious one for everybody, making it into... But they're in the losers bracket. They got to play the Valiant. Yeah, there's no signs that say that they're going to slow down. These teams got a week now to figure out what to do next. And the deeper we get in, there's a good possibility the less you're going to see a hog. They're going to figure things out. And we're going to be where we thought we were going to be. The journey getting there has been a rough road, not what we expected. We went to the rental car company, we rented the sports car, and we ended up with the giant SUV instead. It still gets us to where we need to go, and it has the same possibilities of time and all that getting there. It's just not the way we wanted to get there, in my estimation. Yeah, I don't like the way things are sitting. It's turning people off in the league, out of the league, fans of the league. You want your team to think, you want to think your team has a good shot at winning, going in. You look at the possibilities and how they've been playing and all that. And if you're a fan of the teams in the middle to the lower, it's a toss-up anyway right now. It was a toss-up in the last meta. Would have been there. Paris did not perform well in this meta. So that's one of the outliers in the Justice, really. In the Asia side, I really don't have as much problem. They all beat up on each other anyway. I expected more out of Hangzhou and Guangzhou, But, you have Profit and Gesture playing things that they want to play, and they're taking their playoff mentality in, or like they did in Season 1, and they're doing damage. But beginning of the year, you could say, yeah, Seoul, or when we did the Asia split thing, Seoul, they were up there with Shanghai. In fact, I think I had Seoul ahead of them before we started matches and all that. Once we got through the COVID initially, and we got the teams over there, and we got the structure and all that. That's my take on the grand scheme of the things. Please comment down below. Let's hear what you guys have to say. I mean, it sounded all negative, but all in all, it was fun to watch. I am going to say that. I enjoyed watching some of the stuff. Some of the things Janu was doing on Roadhog, yanking people out of windows, pulling people off a high ground, Stitch just murdering people. And then you have Arc and Aim God playing really well. And of course, Decay just literally, I think Uber called it one of the announcers called it the MS Paint Eraser Zarya play. But it was on the whole, once we got into the games and you got out of your head some of it, it was still Overwatch. It was still fun. And let's talk about the matches now. Now, last episode we talked the knockout rounds in NA, and we talked about Chengdu and London. But we got into the double elimination part of the tournament. So we're going to talk about round 3 and the losers bracket in NA, and then we'll also jump into the Asia bracket after we talk about that for a minute, and we'll get into their knockout round and first, then take it from there. So let's talk about NA first. All right. Because this is where we had the meat of our matches for the weekend, because obviously more teams, bigger brackets. All right, so we'll just run down the schedule really quick. We had the Fusion beating the Gladiators 3-0. Valiant once again taking down the Mayhem 3-2. San Francisco beating the Justice 3-2. Atlanta beating Paris 3-2. And then we moved to Sunday, where we had the Mayhem staying alive, beating the Gladiators, knocking them out. Washington 3-0ing Paris, knocking them out. And then we had the Fusion 3-0ing the Valiant in the upper bracket. And the Shock defeating the Reign 3-1 in the upper bracket, setting up the first day of the next round, which we'll talk about later on in the week. So let's talk about these matches. Okay, Philadelphia right now could be the best team in the league. They are playing at an extremely high level, and they disposed of the Gladiators like they weren't even there. It was an impossible scenario for the Gladiators, because the two teams that give them the most trouble really lied in their way. I'm sure they were hoping the Valiant lost to the Mayhem as well. It just played out bad for them, really. It just did not work out. Two teams that they're not the greatest against. Yeah, they had that one match against Philadelphia, but Philadelphia plays on a different level. They have so many different guys right now, and they are cohesive as hell. They're coached really well. They know them. Any kind of iteration of this meta, they're playing fantastically, no matter who they put in there. Poco, Fury, Ivy, Carpe, Hisu, you name it. And you got Alarm, and on the support line, that's just a god. They just look very refined, very, very hard to beat, and the Gladiators just stood no chance. And the next match was the Valiant once again defeating the Mayhem. They just have their number, and they are out for blood against the Mayhem every time, and I don't like it at all. Because I root for the Mayhem. So when I saw that they had to play the Valiant, I was not thrilled about that. I am not going to lie. That was one of the things I was not looking forward to. I thought maybe someone could give them a little bit of give them a little trouble, but or pick them ahead of the Mayhem, I should say. The powers that be let them fall to the Mayhem's lap, and here we are. And I think strategically San Francisco played that right, and they took the Justice. Like I said on the other episode, they knew that the Valiant give the Mayhem trouble, so knock the Mayhem down. Not that San Francisco has a problem with the Mayhem, but you don't know in this meta. You don't know who's going to be good, who's going to be bad. And, the Mayhem just did what they normally do in these situations against the Valiant. They don't finish fights. They don't finish. The Valiant do. The Valiant clutch wins out. They keep fights alive, make the necessary plays when they have to against Florida, and once again, they did that. BQB, I think, is still sitting on an EMP from the middle section of the Oasis final map there. Got EMP. Sometimes much like Blizzard, they want too much polish on things. Where you see the Valiant, they get EMP. They're like, all right, let's go, let's rip this. The Mayhem want it to be too practiced, too much of a not taking a gamble, but waiting for the opportune time to do it. Sometimes in a playoff situation, in a big match, you just need to let it rip. And that was one of the things that was unsettling for me, was they sat on that and they didn't use it. Yeah, all right, you're waiting for an opportune time. It's EMP. I get that. It's impactful. But with the amount and the speed that BQB builds up in EMP, you can afford to do an EMP in a situation where you can flip the point, possibly win a fight, clutch something out, but they didn't do it there. And that sent Florida down into the lower bracket, as we're calling it, because there are no losers. Apparently, we're in 1990s Little League. I call it the losers bracket, much like Wolf does. So the Mayhem get dropped down to the losers bracket after that, as well as the Gladiators. We did not mention the Gladiators got dropped down there. And then the next match was quite frightening for San Francisco. The Justice, doing what they do, come out, take a 2-0 lead. San Francisco has to clutch up and come back and beat them 3-2. San Francisco looks shaky. Yes, they do. They were really good with the previous iterations that we had with metas. They looked a little weird with the Genji meta. They still made it through. Same thing with this. They didn't look the best, but when push came to shove, they did what they had to do. They barely, they lost a 5-4 match on Kings Row. You can say what you want about that. Close. San Francisco clutch out on Gibraltar, and then they clutch out in... That's the thing with a team that's at that high of a skill level. Once they start figuring things out and what you're going to do, they eventually get it. This time they did. Now, against Philadelphia, in this scenario, I don't think they will. If Philadelphia gets them down 2-0 in this tournament, in this iteration, the way Philly's playing, I don't see them losing that match. That being said, that dumped Washington down into the losers bracket, and now they are poised to make a run down there. And they could, with this meta and the way their players are playing, outside of Decay as well. Making that very clear. Stitch was unbelievable this weekend. Janu, unbelievable. Their support line was fantastic. Their tank line was great. Like I said, Decay, and then you throw Decay in there doing damage like a maniac on fucking Zarya. They're hard to beat. San Francisco managed to figure it out and beat them. Now, these teams have a week to prepare for what's coming up. I don't know where they're going to go, but Washington looks good to do some damage down in that lower bracket. Now, let's move on to Sunday in NA. We started off with the losers bracket, and the Mayhem, they have the Gladiators number. I don't know what it is. They were pissed that they lost to the Valiant again, and it showed. They came out and they worked. they worked the Gladiators pretty hard. 3-0'd them. Let everybody know, hey, look, we're still in this. Don't sleep on us. We're gonna try and make a run down the bottom here, which is one of the things I thought coming in. I thought they could make a run on the lower. The players on the Valiant, some of them, McGravy, a couple of the other guys, they feel like they're being disrespected because everybody has the Mayhem ahead of them. At this point, they might not be wrong. They beat them every time. They're about on the same level. The games are close, and he might have a point there. Here we are. So the next match, then that sent the Gladiators home for the season. Next match, we had Washington, who let that one slip through their fingers against the Shock, taking on Paris, who do not have a grasp of the meta, while Washington does. Washington just wiped them. And, here we are. We're talking about the first really high seed to get knocked out, which is Paris, number 3. Not counting Asia, less teams. And it's unfortunate. Paris was playing great. I thought they would make a nice run here. You can't really complain about the season too much if you're a Paris fan. It just, like we said in the beginning, the meta really just fucked teams, and this is the biggest case of that. Not counting Houston, who got outplayed. As you look at that more and more, yeah, you could say some of the picks that Houston made, comp-wise were weird. But from all reports, they were playing that really well. Whatever. That's Houston. Paris, next year, I can't wait to see what happens next year. They're going to be phenomenal. They have a young roster. These guys are all top talent. They're all like in MVP, Rookie of the Year, all those categories. They're going to be great next year. It's just they fell short this year by things kind of outside of their own doing. That being said, like the meta, it just mind fucked them. They're young. They'll be back. And, Washington continues their little run here. 3-0. They obviously, all the things we said before, same thing applies in this match. They all look great. I can't deny that. The meta's working out in their favor, but guys performing that weren't performing before have new life, it seems, since Decay got to this team. And, that plays into back in the beginning of the show. But we had that. Now the Valiant beat the Mayhem in a close one. They got absolutely steamrolled by Philly, who has the biggest grasp on everything right now. Atlanta managed to pull one out against Paris. I applaud them for that. That was the best that they've played. The last two games that Atlanta played were the best two games they've played all season long, bar none, maybe minus a game in the beginning of the season that I've totally forgotten about. When things were totally different and at a homestand or something like that. But they performed really well. Until they got to the Shock, they just were no match for the Shock. The Shock are starting to get things a little bit back on track in this one, and they just buried them 3-1. It's hard to go against the Shock. Once they have a little bit more of they have a little bit more of the meta and what's working and what's not working going through. They have the players that are enabled to do the things that are necessary to win. They make the right swaps and hero swaps and player swaps during the course of a match to take care of business, and they do. Now that leaves us with, we'll just talk about the bracket really quick. What's left, the aftermath, and we're not going to get into predictions and all that on this show. We'll talk about that later on in the week, but that leaves us with something we kind of were thinking along these lines in a way. You can't deny it. What do we have? We have Philly, San Francisco, and then in the lower bracket, we have Atlanta, Florida, Valiant, Washington. Washington probably being the outlier there. I thought maybe the Gladiators would be better. I thought Paris could be. It's close to where, in the your estimation, if you're thinking about this before the tournament started and maybe without the patch, where we would be in this bracket. It's close to that, minus the one outlier. On the weekend, we have two different losers bracket matches after the Shock play Philly. So we'll have Atlanta, Florida, and then we'll have the Valiant Justice, and then the winner of those two matches play each other. And then we'll have Philly, San Francisco, and then one will advance. The other will go down to play one of four teams, Atlanta, Florida, Valiant, or Washington. And then we move on to the grand finals. So let's move to Asia. So we didn't talk about the knockout rounds. No, except for the Chengdu match. Chengdu took care of business like we thought. They came in. We knew that this was kind of working in their favor. Now New York comes up against them. They pick them. Hangzhou gets Seoul dumped on them. New York takes care of business against Seoul, albeit not the best performance, but Chengdu's weird, and I always go over this. They're either going to make a deep run or they're going to fail miserably. They played well enough against New York. New York just is a superior team. Beat them 3-1. New York running some dive stuff. CBOB looked pretty good, which, we saw a little return to some of his things. It seems to be something that they want to run. Obviously, Jonak looked decent. The normal run for New York, albeit a little closer than I wanted this match to be. Now, the next match, Seoul. All of a sudden, Prophet thinks it's 2018, and so does Gesture. Prophet comes out, destroys everybody on Hangzhou, and leaves them with a disappointing season. For the most part, the Seoul Dynasty just destroyed them. Regardless of patch and all of the other things, I think this would have been a close match anyway. I don't think it would have been a 3-0, but I would have leaned towards Seoul a little bit. Pressure situation, the players they got. Yeah, Hangzhou has some, but I just like Seoul's players better at certain times, and this is one of them. Now, let's move on to the next round. We have our regular season juggernaut in the APAC region. The Shanghai Dragons taking care of business again against New York. New York didn't look terrible. Shanghai just looked like Shanghai. They came out, didn't miss a beat, much like Philadelphia. They have the players to do what they need to do in these meta shifts and things like that. Cream rises to the top. You have guys like Fleta and the cast of characters that are just doing what they do. A lot of people were calling, well, maybe we will see, but Shanghai takes care of business here. Next up, we had Seoul gutting the Charge. This was the biggest surprise on the Asia bracket for me. People can say Hangzhou Seoul was a surprise. I kind of leaned on Seoul to win that. I didn't think they were going to come out and do this to Guangzhou as well. They go through the playoffs and have not given up a map yet, which is hilarious, given the amount of times they've gotten 3-0 this year. But they came out, same story in this one. Prophet, Gesture playing really well. Guangzhou just did not have it in this match. I don't know if it was, I think they're a little rusty. That was a couple of teams that we saw that had long breaks kind of didn't look too good. Guangzhou, Houston, Shanghai was up fine. They didn't have like a terribly long break. They had 1 week off in between. But the teams that hadn't played, Chengdu looked okay, but they played London, who was not playing well at all. Those teams with the long break did not look great. Guangzhou was one of them. I think the losers bracket match is going to be interesting. The first one with them playing New York, I think that's going to be a fantastic match. Now, these two teams are fighting for their lives, and one of them I did not expect to be. I thought we'd have a New York Seoul situation down there. But you know what? Guangzhou, they did not play well, so they're down there. And then the final match of the upper bracket is going to be Shanghai and Seoul, which I think Seoul's going to give them a fight. We'll talk more about it, but right now, I think Seoul is playing the best they played all year. And the problem is they got Shanghai, and then they're going to have the potential to have to face New York or Guangzhou. Obviously, they can beat Guangzhou. They beat them once already in this tournament, but who knows week to week with Seoul? You don't know what you're going to get. But that's going to wrap up the matches. But that's going to do it, guys. We are 1 week into the playoffs. We got our bracket set up for next week. Next up, I'll have the preview show for the final weekend of playoffs before we get our Final Four set to go to Asia and play in the Grand Finals weekend. And in the in-between, we're going to be doing some other things. We'll talk some more awards. We're going to talk teams where they're at, the teams that got knocked out. We're going to start that up. We'll start from the bottom up and work our way through the teams, have discussions about them, and see what they need and what some of the things that they could do to improve themselves. Obviously, some teams are going to take longer than others in that, but we're going to have open up some discussions about teams that have been knocked out, and then regardless of the meta discussions and the other things that were involved in this tournament, but their year on the whole, we'll recap and start those up and get those going and get some team discussions, and then obviously we'll highlight a little bit of the all-star stuff that goes on and the weekends in between, and then get to the grand finals and talk about all that fun stuff, because the end of the season is upon us, and then we have the off season and all that leads up to next season. But that's going to do it for this one, guys. Thank you very much for all of your support on YouTube. It's greatly appreciated. Likes, subscribes, views, all of that kind of stuff. It really fuels me to try and make better and better content for you guys and to talk more about Overwatch League. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. That's going to do it. This is Misfit. I'm out. Everybody stay safe. Have a good rest of your day. And I'll talk to you on the next one.